everyone, and thank you for the invitation to Friday Frontiers. We're really delighted to be here with you and to discuss our ongoing work on developing an infrastructure for 3D scholarship. And although Susan and myself are presenting today, this is the work of many colleagues, both within our Maastricht University Pure 3D team, but also project collaborators who have provided input at various stages of the project we'll be talking about, and many of them who have also helped with or even led the project's technical development, and we will show you them later. But just a thank you to all our collaborators for this work. So we will start by discussing, well, why 3D and why now? Arguing that after 40 years of 3D scholarship, we're at the critical moment. Conditions have matured enough, and we need to take serious steps to develop infrastructural frameworks to better support the presentation and preservation of 3D heritage, as well as the use of 3D as an instrument that provides researchers with new ways of developing hypotheses and interpretations. We'll talk about the concept of a 3D scholarly edition, giving you some of the background and explaining how we embrace this in our Pure 3D project. We will then discuss 3D as a form of publication in the context of our other project, Oper 3D, and we will conclude by exploring potential futures, both for our infrastructure, but also for 3D more generally. So our research focuses on 3D scholarship, and our definition of it is essentially the creation and use of three-dimensional models and reconstructions in academic research. It involves creating digital representations of physical artifacts, of buildings, of landscapes, or developing virtual worlds as holistic environments that can aid researchers to explore and analyze historical, cultural, and sociocultural phenomena, therefore providing insights that are not possible with traditional two-dimensional media or conventional practices used in different fields. And to put it very bluntly, there's a lot of 3D out there. Some spurred by the promise of virtual reality and the metaverse, some because of the institutional pressure to produce more than two-dimensional images of tangible heritage in 3 dimensions, some because of national, European and international initiatives. And of course, we cannot underestimate the fact that it is very easy nowadays to produce 3D, not necessarily good 3D, but some form of 3D, even with our phones. And for 3D, COVID provided an opportunity. Mass digitization intensified due to the closure of heritage sites and museums during the lockdowns. Museums worked towards offering more virtual access to their collections. These were typically in the form of 360 tours like a Google Street View, which in many cases were not very successfully implemented as virtual visitors could not access any information about the objects and their context, but could simply virtually walk by the displays, as you can see on your screen in the central bottom pane. So with objects not presented in detail, also as the resolution was not high enough, essentially it was digitization for the sake of it. So in 2021, the European Commission advocated that 3D digitization should be undertaken by heritage organizations, essentially on a massive scale, for preservation, for access, for innovative use, and for research. And this is being supported financially. However, by putting really high targets for 2030, so in the next essentially 5-6 years, makes someone wonder if member states really have the capacity to deal with this, because it's not only the digitization of heritage, but also storage, is public display, archiving, dissemination, and for the time being, there's no infrastructure to support this full cycle. But of course, the EU is currently investing more money than it has ever invested, over 100 million in cultural heritage initiatives, digital heritage initiatives, where 3D is a strategic priority. DARIAH is also involved in many of these infrastructures, including the European Collaborative Cloud for Cultural Heritage. ECHOS was recently launched. Also the Common European Data Space for Cultural Heritage. There are campaigns such as the recent Twinit campaign where member states were encouraged to digitize in 3D their cultural heritage. So all this creates essentially an environment where shows that the next maybe 5-6 years are very critical for 3D scholarship, because the volume of online 3D visualizations will really surpass the total produced over the last 4 decades. And there are also other initiatives for developing infrastructures for digitized cultural heritage, again with 3D being a strategic priority. UNESCO, for example, is developing their own platform, the Dive into Heritage, an online tool to make World Heritage and its related intangible heritage more accessible to the general public. Its first phase of development, which based on the website is ending now, is supported by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But when we recently looked at the site to prepare for this presentation, we didn't find any further information about the project's progress, so we don't know at what status the infrastructure is, or if there is an infrastructure already. And of course, it is encouraging that several projects are problematizing issues of sustainability, of standards, of quality, intellectual transparency, and infrastructure. So there is a lot of movement at the moment around 3D objects. But one of the issues we see with 3D is that there are really lots of digitized objects online, but many of these are missing their social, their cultural and historical context, because typically we find them with very minimal information and even less information than what a visitor would see at a museum, where at least we see the objects within their spatial and temporal contextualizations. And for 3D models to be truly useful, they need more than just being presented as like a twirly thing. They need contextualization, they need annotation, they need apparatus, they need information on how the object was created, a storage space for preservation, indications as to their potential reuse. And in effect, we need bespoke frameworks and software for 3D models to become part of a sustainable scholarly ecosystem, similar to what we are accustomed to for textual scholarship. Probably we all know Sketchfab. In 2019, they announced that they had already 100,000 3D models on their platform, 100,000 3D models for cultural heritage. And Sketchfab has been up to very recently the go-to platform for the research and heritage sectors to make these 3D models available. It's a relatively simple platform to use, and once the models are in Sketchfab, institutions and projects can use an iframe to embed their models into their own websites. Sketchfab also had an extremely friendly policy towards cultural heritage, encouraging them to make use of the platform. But of course, we should not forget that Sketchfab is a commercial platform. So a couple of years ago, Sketchfab was obtained by Epic Games. Last year, they laid off the cultural heritage lead in Sketchfab, Thomas Flynn. And back then, I think we all started wondering what the future holds for Sketchfab and for the many organizations and individuals that have their models online, not only as a means to present them, but also for some of them, or actually for many of them, as a means to deposit them and store them. And it is only a month ago that we got the announcement that Sketchfab is transitioning to Fab. It was the 18th of September 2024 that an email went to all registered users saying we are excited to share that Fab, Epic's new digital marketplace, will launch in mid-October. When Fab launches, it will replace the Sketchfab store, and you will no longer be able to buy or sell assets on the Sketchfab store. And they have not said yet if Sketchfab will close down, but certainly the aim is to create an online store for buying and selling 3D models. So the purpose will really change there. And at the moment, there's quite some panic in the cultural heritage community. A petition has been launched, and there are many comments on social media with people who have 3D heritage assets on Sketchfab wondering what will happen with their work, since the transition to Fab is not very smooth. Licensing models are different. It does not support analytics like comments, but also annotations. And of course, we have to say that's understandable because Fab is a marketplace. And in many ways, one cannot blame a private company for changing their policy of being a free or low-cost repository for 3D assets, but it is another example of the 3D modeling community relying on the private sector for what should be a public infrastructure. And to be fair, there are many projects that have developed viewers. The most well-known is 3D Hop from the Visual Computing Lab in CNR in Italy, on which actually other platforms and applications have been based, such as the dynamic collections from Dark Lab at the University of Lund. There is Compact as well, developed by the Institute for Digital Humanity in Cologne. But none of these have really the plug-and-play simplicity of Sketchfab, and most are simply viewers. And that is to say that they have no infrastructure behind them, so that institutions or whoever wishes to use them needs to deploy them on their own servers, but also build what they need for their own user requirements. And of course, other things can be built around these 3D viewers, but this means that they require substantial resources, not only to develop these, but also to sustain them, which is the biggest challenge because most of these projects are based on soft grant funding. And of course, those of us working for quite some time with 3D, I think we have been frustrated many times. So these are some examples of the frustrations we have been facing. 3D scholarship has been heavily influenced by the software used to create the 3D models. There are so many formats that are not interoperable, so it makes it difficult to collaborate and share models. There are no standards in the way we do modeling. There are no standards in the way we disclose our decision-making process. So transparency is an issue. Photorealism also has haunted the field for many years, therefore overshadowing other important aspects of 3D visualization. And of course, it's this non-conventional nature of 3D scholarship that makes it difficult to evaluate and integrate into established scholarly frameworks. So these are all issues that both Susan and I have been thinking about, or challenges that we were facing in our work, initially separately. Me as an archaeologist who was using 3D as an interpretative tool, and Susan as a literary scholar working on a 3D project, Contested Memories, the Battle of Mounster Bridge, using 3D visualization as a means to better understand how the battle unfolded. And I will let Susan tell the rest of the story.
Okay. So as Costas said, our collaboration began some time ago. We were both working in Ireland at Maynooth University. And when I first picked this slide, it was really easy to find images of archaeologists like Costas. I don't know if he's had experience like this, but they loom large in the public imagination. But finding images of scholarly editors was not so easy, and your man at the bottom was the nearest I could find. And when we were preparing for this talk, Costas said, you know, they're both male. And so I went where all the students go, to DALI, to ask it to make a female scholarly editor. And it had this lovely young woman who I think doesn't look like me, in a lovely large office, which I also don't have. But in our conversations, it was clear that scholarly editing of printed texts and manuscripts in both print and digitally, we have a rich tradition of editing practices, new digital standards such as TIXML. And as I began working more in 3D, I realized there were no similar practices. So we came up with this idea of 3D digital scholarly editions, and we published 2 articles which established and explained the concept. It's a quite novel idea, and every time we have to explain it, we get quite skeptical looks because we have decided in this conceptual framework that the text of 3D in 3D is the 3D model. And so just as the work of textual critics is to provide a better understanding of the creation and historical transmission of the text and its variants, the goal of the 3D edition is to reframe 3D not simply as a visualization or, as Costas mentioned earlier, a twirly thing, but as an object that's contextualized historically, socially, culturally, and methodologically. So a 3D digital scholarly edition can act as both a theoretical framework as well as an infrastructure to support the affordances of three-dimensionality as a research tool and include robust contextualization, information, textual, multimodal, metadata, paradata in various forms, including in-world annotations or supplementary side sources, while also operating as a fora for scholarly arguments and/or critical debates. So within this scholarly editing paradigm, the 3D object, it could be a single object or a collection of artifacts or a virtual world, is considered the text. And as we've been working through the concept, we've expanded our understanding of these editions as information spaces that convey a scholarly argument about an object or a space in a single spatio-temporal environment that's immersive, multivariant, and multisensorial. So these 3D models become the text of conventional publication paradigms. And this is done by means of contextualization with multimodal annotations. You can see some of this here. The documentation of metadata, paradata, that's the documentation of the creation process to provide users with access to the modeling and interpretive choices of the author or editor, as well as the scholarly arguments. And in doing so, we believe that we've created an infrastructure that we cannot replicate in print. So the goal is to create this intertextual network that provides the potential for linking the editorial, the epistemological, and the technical process involved in 3D knowledge production. At the same time, this type of edition bifurcates, responds to this kind of bifurcated nature of 3D scholarship where you have the 3D model, maybe you could find a video of it, maybe it's on Sketchfab, but the argument around it is published in a very traditional scholarly journal. In 2019, we both moved to Maastricht University. About a year later, we applied for infrastructure funding to create what we call Pure 3D. It's a 4-year research project funded by the Dutch Platform for Infrastructure and Social Science and the Humanities. It was once off, and it aimed at supporting existing infrastructure developments in the Netherlands. It began in 2021, it's finishing this December, and our goals were and are to develop an infrastructure for authoring and viewing 3D scholarly editions, provide the systems and tools for depositing 3D editions, including the files associated under FAIR principles, and provide a framework, conceptual, methodological, for recognizing and rewarding 3D scholarship. As with most infrastructure projects, it takes a village, and the slide represents most, but not all, of our collaborators in the Netherlands. But as the project emerged, we began exploring viewers to integrate into the infrastructure because we felt we didn't have enough funding to build one from scratch. And we didn't want to be honest, keep reinventing the wheel. So the most robust viewer we found is developed by the Smithsonian Institution. It also has the greatest institutional support, and it's called Voyager. The Voyager toolkit has 2 interfaces, 2 parts to it. Explorer is the front end for viewing the artifacts by the public, and Story is the authoring interface for adding annotations, multimedia content, creating tours, etc. And as partners, they have been fabulous. They've been working with us since we started this to integrate features that have come up as a result of our editions or the focus groups. And it's been a fabulous partnership. So we began with a broad range of Dutch heritage institutions as our pilot projects, and these range from digitized objects to virtual worlds and come from quite different fields: history, archaeology, architecture, art history, and they're being developed for very different audiences. Over the past 3 years, when we added them up, we were a bit surprised. We have over 60 3D scholarly editions. Some are from our pilot projects, but we've also had 2 open calls. The second set of projects are just finishing now, and they even come from a larger number of fields: archaeology, media, paleontology, and most recently medicine. And it's really made it clear to us that the concept of the 3D scholarly edition is not limited to the humanities. I was also invited just at the tail end of COVID to Tokyo University to give a series of workshops, and there's also quite a number of editions from that initiative. Last spring, Costas, I, and our PhD student, Kelly Gillian-Schwery, taught a class. It's a Media Studies MA at Maastricht University, and we created, or the students created, 20 editions around the theme, the concept of toys. And we will do more this year. We teach in a Media Studies course, so we ask students to contextualize the objects from multiple perspectives. You can see some of that here: social, cultural, media, historical, economic, and of course, nostalgic. This summer, Kelly and I went to Washington and we did a workshop there for their curators and educators and digital media specialists from a wide variety of museums. And those editions are coming online soon. But as the project progressed, we realized we had to invest much more into training than we'd initially anticipated. How to teach people not just how to use Voyager, but how to conceptualize a 3D edition, because we're so used to creating narrative linear arguments. And there has to be a balance between the different media that you use. It can't overwhelm the reader with too much to interact with, and it has to have some kind of narrative space. So in both the training and the design of the infrastructure, we adopted an iterative design cycle, beginning with our pilot projects and expanding out to other disciplines and collaborators using the platform. So just briefly also, we have been developing an infrastructure. So as we've been discussing, the edition is about much more than putting a 3D model online. Not only does the model have to be created, it needs to be embedded and contextualized within a scholarly narrative. So while Voyager provides the viewing environment and editing, the platform provides the workspace, the authentication needed to work securely, and ultimately a place for the edition to be published on a public server. So today the workflow begins with one of the Pure 3D team opening up an edition for an author. We'll speak about this, Costas will speak about it in a few minutes, but we envision the workflow beginning in future outside of the Pure 3D infrastructure, possibly in open journal systems in which an author will apply to create an edition. If the project's approved, there'll be a variety of online training materials available, and if we can sustain this after the project ends, we'll be doing synchronous training. The edition space is open, collaborators can be invited, teams can upload their models, create related materials, the annotations in the tours, as you saw with the Mount Street. Also, we believe annotations are those camera views that guide the user. And authors can also view the editions in the public mode before publication. These are the wireframes we've been working with. The infrastructure should be published before the grant finishes in December. You can just keep going. There are different wireframes for both how the you'll find discovery, all the different projects, and once you get like on the right side to a particular edition. And I think I hand over to Costas again. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes.
So we believe the time is right to view 3D scholarship more holistically, not only as a research tool, but also as a form of publication. And 3D scholarship is not an exception to the so-called double publication that has long been at play in the digital humanities, where conventional publication about the digital humanities artifact or tool is required in addition to the digital object or resource itself. And particularly if you're a digital humanities person looking at tenure, at promotion, or some other forms of recognition, this is fairly critical. So to explore this idea of publishing 3D scholarship, we got a grant from our national funding agency, MVO, to explore what is needed to turn pure 3D into a publication infrastructure with a publication and peer review workflow for 3D scholarly editions. And just to give a bit of background, discussions about evaluating digital scholarship, particularly in the context of digital humanities, date back to when the field was still called humanities computing. And these discussions became more prominent in the early 2000s when, for example, committees and task forces in organizations started developing guidelines and position papers with a call to action addressed mostly to academic review committees and university policy makers. For example, the Modern Language Association Committee published some guidelines in the early 2000s that were revised in 2012. In 2011, there was a special section of Profession edited by Susan Schreibman and Mandel and Olsen that features seminal digital humanities figures who gave their own perspective to the recognition and rewarding of scholarly communication and investigation through digital media. There were other special issues in the Journal of Digital Humanities, and also many scholars, including Rupika Risam and Julian Naihan, have also discussed this idiosyncratic nature of digital scholarship and what is needed to be recognized and rewarded. And very recently, the working group eHumanities of the European Federation of Academies of Sciences and Humanities released a report that discusses the cross-cutting issues pertinent to digital practices in the humanities and provide recommendations on evaluating particular case studies of innovative outputs. And on the right, you can see some of the recommendations on review and evaluations. And what is interesting, they're not talking particularly about 3D, but many of these also were identified by our research that focus on 3D digital scholarship. So we see that in the past few years, there have been really a renewed interest in discussing digital scholarship. And of course, technologies are becoming more mature, more sustainable. There are more standards. There is all these national and international investment. We talk about in digital infrastructures, but also partly because of the work being done to change the common practices in research assessment. And of course, we have examples like the DORA Declaration. We have the Coalition for Research Assessment. DARIAH is also a partner there. DARIAH itself also wrote a position paper that was published recently on the role of research infrastructures in reforming research assessments. In the Netherlands, we have recognition rewards. So there's really lots of movement around digital outputs and how these can be recognized and rewarded. And in the past few years, there have also been attempts to deal with 3D scholarship and what we call this double publication or this bifurcation, where you have the 3D model separately from the text, from the actual article. And a few journals have started supporting the embedding of 3D models in online publications, and also a few publishing houses such as Michigan and Stanford University Press supported the creation of digital monographs and projects, but unfortunately none of these proved sustainable. So what we wanted to do with this project is essentially to see what are the benefits, what are the challenges of evaluating 3D scholarship, what is needed for authors, but also for reviewers to review this kind of work. And we followed a mixed methods approach. So we did a survey, we did focus groups, we did interviews, we did some workshops. And we identified several themes. We'll be publishing an article on that soon, so I will not delve very much into the results, but maybe I will highlight a few points. So Firstly is that the opinions on peer review as a system in academia are really varied and needs to be reevaluated when used with 3D scholarship. We saw a tension there, even for people who produce this kind of non-digital outputs. They think that traditional modes of peer review are more appropriate. There is a great interest in having 3D research peer-reviewed, but there are lots of challenges for both reviewers and authors, including the stability of the technology and the expertise of the reviewers. And also there was quite some discussion as to the requirements. What is really needed to implement such an approach to follow this kind of measures to publish 3D scholarship. And we asked them, well, several questions also to see who are the people who are responding to this work. And it's not surprising that most people publish their 3D on the web using a web viewer like Sketchfab, and some often include a hyperlink to a conventional publication. A few also include 3D in a repository, which is a good practice, but then 3D also becomes just a reference in a text-based article. So we did not really see the integration of a narrative or of an argument in 3D, and I think that's because we are lacking the infrastructure for that. What was a very interesting outcome was that most people said that we would like to either be peer-reviewed, or when we act as reviewers, to follow a double-blind system for peer-reviewing 3D scholarship. So it's very interesting to get this from people who develop this kind of outputs. But when we started discussing this question more intensely in focus groups and interviews with 3D researchers, they tended to lean more towards a more open peer-review system. Saying that, well, blind reviews are rarely truly blind, particularly for a field that is so small and we kind of know each other. And of course, they express several challenges, both from an author's perspective and a reviewer's perspective. Sustainability always came first. So yes, we can publish, but is our work going to stay there, stay online? So sustainability was an issue. There was a concern about the reviewers, like, do you have the right reviewers that have expertise in the technology, but also on the subject? And of course, then this was hand in hand with managing expectations for reviewers, in a sense that, well, we're using a platform that can do X amount of things, but maybe reviewers expect something else, but then it's the affordances of the platform that constrain us. At the same time, from the reviewer's perspective, also they thought that they really need to have a lot of guidance to do that, apart from a good infrastructure to do it. And we saw also lots of hesitancy in terms of interacting with a 3D model. Again, even from people who are actually producers of 3D scholarship. So I think there is an interesting discussion and conversation to have there. We also asked them, what kind of criteria do you want to follow when your work is being peer reviewed? And we also did lots of like interactive work with focus groups and workshops to essentially have them design a publication workflow. What would be an ideal workflow for peer reviewing 3D? And based on their input, we developed the first publication workflow that we're now testing, which essentially we're talking about 3 stages. One is the concept proposal that goes to the editorial board, and then we accept it or reject it. Then it goes to the second stage, which is the alpha review, where it's a small component of the 3D and the narrative that is being reviewed, and then it's the final review that then is also reviewed more holistically. So in the coming months, we are, and we have already started testing this workflow for its feasibility. There are issues that may arise, such as time investment for peer reviewers. We saw that everyone was really happy to be involved, but we know how peer review, what is happening with peer review nowadays with journals. It's really difficult to find peer reviewers, and definitely such a system where reviewers might need to also look at the technology part and also the subject, the subject of the edition might make things even more complicated, I think. And in line with our survey, the focus groups, the interview responses, we have also begun implementing technical requirements. So we have started developing training materials for reviewers and authors, developing guidelines, publishing evaluation criteria, and so forth. Some of these are already on the Pure 3D website, so you can already find them there. But again, we'll be testing those in the coming months. And of course, if you would be interested in becoming a peer reviewer, you can scan the QR code on your screen and respond to a few questions about your subject expertise and familiarity with 3D. And the idea is that all reviewers will be listed on our website. So, is 3D publication possible? Then I think, well, the answer is yes, and we're talking about the reform of research assessment, but what we also see through this, even from people who produce these non-typical outputs, is that there is difficulty to conceptualize an output that is not text-based. So change needs really to come from within. People asked for a reliable infrastructure for publishing and reviewing 3D. They're talking about standards to simplify the peer review process, but also to motivate the reviewers. Reviewers that need to have both subject and 3D expertise, reviews that should not be done at the end of the project, because of course developing in 3D is rather big, so maybe doing that in iterations so they have opportunities to intervene earlier. And of course what came up really prominently is institutional recognition of 3D scholarship. That's also very important for authors to invest in developing these 3D scholarly editions. And speaking about institutional recognition, I think we are proud that with some of our work, also in line with the Recognition Rewards Initiative in the Netherlands, there has been a change in our faculty's career policy under the core activity of conducting and disseminating research. And now digital scholarly editions also are also included as a recognized output. And of course, it's a small win. I think we need a larger change there, but we're confident the circumstances are getting more mature for changing norms and conventional ways of looking at digital and 3D scholarship. So we received initial funding to conceptualize and develop a prototype of the infrastructure, but the funding was not structural. So the question is how this can be sustained without additional resources. And an infrastructure, of course, is not only the technology, but it's also the people to maintain and run it, people who are responsible for training, further developing the community and capacity building. So we have taken a few steps to address this. We have applied for another infrastructure grant that will allow us to, on the one hand, further develop the infrastructure, but most importantly, to develop a sustainability model. In the meantime, we'll be exploring two aspects of 3D scholarship that we did not manage to deal with in the current phase due to financial and time constraints. One is paradata, so the documentation of decision-making process, and this has been funded by the Lawrence Center in collaboration with the eScience Center in the Netherlands. It has two components. On the one hand is bringing together 25 experts in a workshop for 5 days to discuss how decision-making processes can be captured, but also to develop a model for paradata. And for this, we have partnered with the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Smithsonian Institution, and CDOC. And we're also trying to expand the institutional embedding of the infrastructure. And also supported by the eScience Center in the Netherlands, we will be exploring simulation and the use of 3D for analytical purposes in the next 2 years. So how we can archive 3D data, how we can make 3D data fair. This is also something that we need to invest more and further explore. There is a report that will be published as part of Pure 3D developed by DANS, the Data Archiving and Network Services in the Netherlands, but we need to further develop and test that. As we said, we're currently testing the publication workflow and peer review, and we would also like to explore the integration of other 3D viewers in the infrastructure. So the way we have built Pure 3D is rather, I would say, 3D viewer agnostic. We have been using Voyager for the reasons we mentioned earlier, but potentially other viewers could be embedded that will offer other functionalities. And then our idea is that users will be able to select which viewing and authoring environment they will use that better serves their purpose. And I will hand over to Susan for some concluding thoughts.
So I get the last slide. So we feel, and especially after we worked on this presentation, we were talking about it, Costas and myself, that really we have a really fabulous opportunity at this moment for scholarship in 3D. But we should also take this opportunity to not duplicate services and collaborate more and not compete. We have a really interesting opportunity to not repeat issues that we currently have with other formats, because of course they're much older and they were developed in many different ways before we, even could imagine the kind of environment the digital environment that we work in today. Other formats have content created in all kinds of systems and all kinds of standards, in all kinds of services, distributed very widely. And we need new services like aggregators to figure out where the content is and how to get at it. But for 3D, we feel, and this is the real opportunity, we should start by building infrastructure that is inherently interoperable, that we shouldn't build many infrastructures for 3D and have the same problem we have with other types of content, that there may be models out there, but we don't know where they are. We don't even know where to look at them. And that, we think both of us, that was really the beauty of Sketchfab. It was like the one game on the block, and everybody deposited their models there. And so maybe we should learn from that. And what we would like to propose as a concluding idea, that we would advocate for a 3D task force under the auspices of DARIAH to bring the relevant parties together, especially those that are working on these very big infrastructures, to have these kinds of discussions. So thank you very much for listening, and I think we have some time, Vicky, maybe for questions.